Welcome back, everybody, to the Triad of the Forest podcast, a podcast from Puerto Rican friends coming together to do deep dives into Star Wars and other nerd-related media. This is season 5, and today we are really, really excited because we are going to be interviewing author of, amongst many other things, Star Wars The High Republic Convergence, Zoraida Córdova. Welcome to the Triad.
Welcome
We're
to the
so excited
channel.
to have you.
Hola, hello.
Hola, hola. So excited to finally have you. Like, I know we've been talking for a while about chatting. We had talked about celebration for a minute to be able to do
I
something
know.
there, and the stars haven't aligned. But finally, no pun. Well, actually, pun totally intended. We were able to converge today. So so excited to
I love
finally
it.
have you.
I'm excited to be here. Yeah, thank you so much.
It's one of those things where, you know, as kind of like a not like as a Puerto Rican podcast, we're always on the lookout, right, to like look for Latinx creators, and especially if they're involved in Star Wars. So like you're definitely one of the people that have always been on our radar, that we've always been excited to talk about. And after, you know, you published Convergence and High Republic and that whole publishing effort that's so focused on representation, it's really special to have you especially now, since, you know, we're in the middle of phase 3. So I know you can't talk about what's happening in phase 3, but we'll talk a little
I
bit
can.
about phase 2. But
I can share some. I can share what I can. Especially my work in progress.
we'll take whatever you can give to us. So yeah, welcome to the channel. Zoraida Cordova, you know, born in Guayaquil, Ecuador, and like you call New York City home. You started writing when you were 13 years old and haven't stopped. So I think that's a kind of a good point to start everything, because I feel lots of people like to, when they're talking to authors or other creators, they want to just go into what are the Easter eggs or what are the things that happen during the story or all of those things. And I think we're a little more interested in you as a person and like your process and how that then plugs into the work that you create. So why don't we start there, like on your background and your upbringing, how you ended up in New York, how you ended up writing. So tell us a little bit about that, about your background there a little bit.
Yeah, so I was born in Guayaquil, Ecuador, and I we immigrated to the United States when I was around 6.
Hmm.
And it was a really big change, but I feel like because I was so little,
Yeah.
I didn't feel it right away. And because I grew up in a very Latin and Black neighborhood in Queens, New York, which is in Jamaica, Queens,
Hmm.
I never really felt, displaced or anything like that. I was also in ES, English as a second language classes, up until I was 10, and then sort of tested out of it. And that was a really interesting change because that's when sort of my language, I felt like my language sort of switched. Um,
Hmm.
and so even though I am fluent in Spanish, it I still like I translate in my brain sometimes, but it's still the language that I reach for in certain situations. Like, I don't know, when I write, sometimes I think about will it sound like in the Spanish translation, but
Hmm.
that's a tangent.
A tangent
We
that
love
we'll
those
get
though.
into.
Yeah.
We'll get into that one. Yeah.
And so that's me and my the thing that I'm always thinking about language and how it affected me as a kid growing up and an adult. And so I did start writing when I was 13. I hated books until then. I just came from a
Really?
school visit. Yeah, I hated books, and the reason I hated books, and people who have heard me on other Star Wars podcasts will already know this, but when I think it was because the teachers always gave me the house on Mango Street.
Hmm.
They're like, "Oh, you are also immigrant. You may like this book," but I didn't really relate to books like House on Mango Street or Esperanza Rising, which are classics and beautiful, but I wanted fantasy, I wanted magic, I wanted Star
Hmm.
Wars, I wanted,
Hmm.
like
Yeah.
Lord of the Rings, I wanted like the TV
Yeah.
show, Sailor Moon and
Yeah.
Gargoyles and X-Men. And so like I
Yes.
wanted that fantasy, but
Mhm.
the only thing that teachers would give me as far as books went were like the sad poor immigrant
Yep, yep,
or the
yep,
sad
yep.
poor Mexican person, because
Hmm.
to them it was all the same.
Yeah.
Um,
Hmm.
because and back to my schooling, all of my teachers were Puerto Rican and Dominican up until I was in place outside of English of ESL classes, and then my teachers were all white.
Hmm.
And so that was also like I feel like that was also a change in the way that
Yeah.
people gave
Hmm.
me books to read. And of course, so I sort of like pushed back against. I'm like, well, I'm not going to read anything at all. I'll watch movies and and fill the well with magical things.
Yeah.
Um, and so then I just kept writing. Then when I was 13, I we got an assignment to write a short story in school as extra credit, and I went above and beyond, and I wrote 13 pages. I didn't have a computer, so it was like a Sunday, so it was and I only remember it because I was sleeping over at my then friend's house,
Hmm.
and I ended up writing 13 pages. But I still got the same extra credit grade as everyone else, and I felt like
Ah.
a deep injustice.
Cheated. Cheated.
Uh-huh. And then from then on, like I made it my mission. I went to a summer writing camp, which was hosted by the National Book Foundation, who of course run the National Book Award. Um, and yeah, just kept doing it until I started interning at a literary agency, and then got my first book deal. And I just kept writing until something. I was like, something's gonna work at some point.
Mhm.
So I just have to keep doing it. Um, and so now I've written 20 books. My 21st book will come out August 27th, which is the Star Wars middle grade
Mhm.
Beware the Nameless.
Congratulations, by
And
the way.
thank
Yeah.
you. So yeah, I'm excited for that. But that's the short long story.
No,
Yeah.
that's great. That's great, and we'll definitely get to High Republic stuff a little later. We'll save that for the end. We want to focus on you now. So, I mean, that's a really interesting story. It kind of goes back a little bit into what I wanted to ask you, because then obviously we want, like, you have a very different upbringing because of your of your heritage and having to come to New York City, and like what you just said about what your experience with professors and how they were giving you all these literary assignments that you might not have connected with. So, how do you think that then all those things and your upbringing kind of influence your writing, or would you say that there was, in a way, kind of a, as you were saying, right? You don't want to at first not connecting with the whole immigrant experience stories that they're giving you because of how it's forced a cliche upon you, I guess. Would you say that
Yeah,
that kind of
yeah.
made you negate that to an extent, and did that then come back into your writing? Because Inheritance of Orquídea Divina, right, that's very about the immigrant experience in many ways, and obviously talks about
Hmm.
magical realism and all these like amazing Latin authors. So what was that connection that you had with like that aspect of you, and how does that come into your writing?
Yeah, I mean, and I do think that it there is a way to relate those books to anybody, right? Like anybody should pick up The House on Mango Street and be like, oh, this is a really wonderful experience. I think that what happens instead is that people think it's the only experience,
Hmm.
right? So
Hmm.
therefore this is the narrative, and so we're only allowed to have this narrative.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of exhausting when you rarely see yourself as a hero in a
Yeah.
TV show or a movie. You see yourself a victim, right, or a problem to
Hmm.
Hmm.
society. And of course, like I think like the types of Latinos, like the country of origin, there's a lot more representation. For some countries versus others. So even for
Hmm.
me, like I could never find a book about Ecuador
Yeah.
in a contemporary setting, but I could still relate to other countries, right? And that, you know, I think it is funny that you mentioned Arquida Divina because it. it's a book that is about immigration without it being like the central topic,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Like
Right.
that's the entire theme of the book. But it's something that happens in the beginning, and then the rest is the aftermath
Mhm.
of the generations after. But it also took me like 10 years or 8 years into my career to write that to put that book out, because the other books were still about they were always fantasy, right? So my first
Mhm.
series is about mermaids in Coney Island. My second series is the Brooklyn Brujas.
Mhm.
um,
Mhm.
and so it's still about magical creatures who straddle two worlds, which is, I feel like that's the immigrant experience, because at home you have one world, and in the outside world, you have a secondary place, right? So there's like, you have two wolves inside of you, right?
Yeah.
One speaks Spanish and one doesn't.
Yeah,
uh,
Exactly.
that is correct.
and and so that's sort of how I approach, and my experience as like, a poor working class immigrant to kid to an adult with like my own job and my own apartment and my own, like,
Yeah.
career. um that all of that has affected my book, and I do think Star Wars is an immigrant experience
Mhm.
in a lot of ways.
Mhm. Yeah.
um a lot of it's about diaspora
Mhm.
Mhm.
and refugees and love and empires, and so it's like, when people are always like, stop making Star Wars political, like, I'm like, Star Wars has always been political. What are you
Yep.
talking
That's
about?
Yep.
Art
correct. Yeah.
art all of art is political, music, everything. And so
Mhm.
I just think it's such a silly argument, and I can't even, like, we shouldn't even give time to that. We just keep making the art. um but yeah, all of those experiences went into the books. And Orquídea Divina definitely felt like a different book, because it was my first adult literary fiction, not like, I guess it's literary fiction. Um, who knows? I don't put things in the genre as like that's what the bookstores do.
Right.
Yeah, that's true. And book doesn't necessarily need to be one genre
Yeah.
either.
Hmm.
So it's up to interpretation a lot. So actually, I'm curious, since you said you like hated books at the beginning, and then it was kind of like organic that you wrote that short story and kind of fell in love with it. But what do you think opened the door for you to actually enjoy reading books?
Oh yes, so that book
Hmm.
was In the Forests of the Night by Amelia Atwater Rhodes,
Mhm.
who she was a 14-year-old author who in 1999 got her first book deal with a real publisher, uh, Random House. Um, and I remember being at the library and I was like, "Oh my god, she's like my age, and
Hmm.
she published a whole book." Or maybe I got it through the Scholastic Book Fair. I can't remember, but one of those. Like, I
Scholastic.
definitely
Yeah.
like I remember getting this book, and I was obsessed with it, and I was obsessed with her. Um, and the idea, like, this girl is my age and she
Yeah,
did this.
did it. Yeah.
I can do it too. And I think that in itself is what representation is about.
Mhm.
Like, Amelia Water Rhodes and I have nothing in common. Like, I'm a Ecuadorian immigrant living in New York, and she was a white teen living in Massachusetts. And so we have like absolutely nothing in common except for
Yeah.
books.
Yeah.
And the just her existing uh made me want to be a writer, and the fact that she did something. So I think it's like that is what, you know, representation actually means to me. Where it's like, we don't have to have everything absolutely in common, but I still see a
Yeah.
part of me reflected in you.
Mhm.
Um, and so I loved her book. Also helped.
Mm.
I read every single one of her books. I know she's still writing, but I haven't looked up since like I aged out of teen.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So I should like go back and see what's new. But that those books, they were about vampires, teenage vampires, and they opened. And then she also wrote Shapeshifters. Um, And her book, Hawk Song, which is about avian shapeshifters and snake
Ooh.
shapeshifters uh, who have to have a marriage alliance in order to save their kingdoms.
Mm.
That inspired Convergence.
Oh, okay, interesting.
Yeah.
Because I was also, I mean, like, also history, like history does this. But I definitely thought about that book when I was writing Convergence, because I was like, oh, so the things that we love are always inspiring us and continue to inspire us. Um, but yeah, that so after that, I just kept reading fantasy, and I would go to the library, the New York Public Library, the Jamaica branch of the Queens Public Library, I should
Mhm.
say. Um, and I would take out as many books as I could. Um, and yeah, that turned me into a reader. That 100-page vampire novel by a 14-year-old girl turned me into a reader.
That's
I
really
love that.
cool. That's really cool because it definitely reminds me of now a lot of people how because it's I mean as times change, like people's engagement with literature or media changes too, and like for the what that reminds me of is like AO3 and like how people with like
Mhm,
fanfic kind of engage through reading in that way, and then also get inspired into writing through fan fiction through the internet. So I think that's really cool to see how people just get inspired to just create through others, through others people's lenses. Uh, and I
mhm.
kind of want to piggyback right on Nani's question there about the author that inspired you, and kind of talk about like other authors too, because going back to Orquídea Divina, the magical realism is very, important into the book and like how it's written, and especially like through like like the past, right? With Orquídea's story, like it's very reminiscent of, at least to me, it was of Isabel Allende or Gabriel Garcia Marquez with 100 Years of Solitude, or The House of the Spirits. So, like, were those authors that you had been reading and authors that you pulled from when you were writing those books? And a little later, I want to talk about like how that can plug into Star Wars. But for now, let's just keep it with Orquídea Divina.
I know everything leads back to Star Wars.
We are a Star
The
Wars podcast, so
I look, I do think I'm glad that you picked up on the Cien Años de Soledad and House of Spirits, because those books were very influential to Latin America itself,
Mhm,
and so
mhm,
yeah.
I I feel like I wanted to write. This is like my love letter to Garcia Marquez.
mhm.
It just has less rape and
Yeah.
incest.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
Yes.
Appreciated. Yeah.
Considerably less.
so
Yeah.
considerably, and yeah, and so those books were sort of like a time capsule of a
Mhm,
generation, and I think that
Yeah.
every generation gets to add and to be in conversation with those books. And so a lot of my biggest inspirations from, like, I was always a big Edgar Allan Poe girly. Like,
mhm, mhm,
I
Oh, yeah.
love Edgar Allan Poe
Yeah.
so much. Like, Edgar Allan Poe and William Blake were the two poets that I memorized the most as like a really emo teenage girl.
yeah.
Um, and I would write their sad poems in my notebook, and like it was definitely my personality from the age of like 15 to 16. And so I think that like those poets were also a big influence on me. Um, the songwriters were also an influence on me, like
Mhm.
the all Latin music. Like I
Mhm,
listen to Latin music, rock music, and then Latin rock. And so I feel like
Yeah.
those are like my three. Of course I listen to pop and everything that's
Yeah.
popular. But it's like, they're never my go-tos, right? Like it's never like every time when I'm sad or I feel like in a weird mood, I put on like the salsa classics playlist, and then I feel
Yeah.
better. So like there's some music that is just it just speaks to you in a different way.
mhm,
Yeah.
um and so and the Latin tradition, like Latinx tradition of songwriting, always tells a huge story within the song. And so that also, I feel like, thinking about how every word is impactful, was a big deal for me. So I feel like all writers are a combination of the things that they love, and so uh and every generation adds to this like giant canon
Yeah.
of books. So, but for me, it's still, you know, those two biggest influences, and you can't not write a magical realism book without
Without.
talking
Hmm.
to you know, Gabo and
Hmm.
Senora Allende.
Yeah.
Which I think is the interesting thing, especially about Isabel Allende. It's just that she has, she's done her YA books. Obviously, she has like all her magical realism books. So she's expanded the breadth, right, of what Latina author can do. Because everyone always thinks of her as just like, oh, she's just this magical realism author, but she has done so much more, which I think is kind of like the inspiring thing about her. But I think one
Well,
of
I
the cool,
think
yeah, go.
what you're going into and what you had mentioned also, Zoraida, is that it goes a lot into like how the education system works. I mean, obviously you had that transition of starting, in South America and then having to go to the States and how you were viewed like as an English as a second language, and then you like opted out, but the way that books are chosen, I think is strange because I did not like writing in Spanish for the longest time. Goose and I went to like bilingual schools here, and then the
Mhm.
way they choose the books, especially for like the Spanish curriculum, they don't do any modern authors. Like
Yeah,
you will get maybe one Gabriel Garcia Marquez, that's it. You never get an Isabel Allende. You'll get like La
that's it.
Carreta, and you'll
Yeah,
get Don
yeah.
Quixote always, but then it's all these books in like such old written
Yeah.
Spanish that sometimes you
Borges, like
need,
all that stuff. Yeah,
yeah, you need, as a Spanish as a first language, you would need a dictionary to read some of these
Oh
books.
yeah, absolutely.
And it was so hard to connect with Spanish authors for me for the longest time. And
Hmm.
like you, I remember I wrote my monografia in Spanish class about Edgar Allan Poe, and my
that's
teacher was
wild.
like, from all the Spanish authors, and this is the Spanish class, and you're doing your monografia on Edgar Allan Poe. I was like, yeah, because every other thing we
Yeah,
read in Spanish, I don't connect with it at all.
That's
yeah.
true. Yeah.
So I think the way that we're being taught, even as first language Spanish, it's they kind of ignore what modern Spanish writing
Yeah.
is, or Latin
Hmm.
authors that write in English, but there's the Latin influence behind it, and
Mhm.
they're kind of like ignored. I feel in the schools. I mean, I went to high school and stuff years ago, but still, I don't think
Same.
it's changed much.
No, I don't think it's changed much.
Yeah.
And I think that because there's like this elitism, right? Like, oh, Don Quixote is a classic, therefore it must be
Hmm.
incredible. And I'm like, Don Quixote is incredibly inaccessible.
Mhm, mhm.
Yeah.
And I remember I knew this guy who's it's years and years ago, like at least 20 years ago. He had done a Spanglish translation
Okay.
of Don Quixote, but he only did like the first chapter. And
Okay.
I should actually check to see. I'm like, you've had 20 years. Did you ever finish it? But
Yeah.
again, that's also inaccessible if you don't read Spanish and English.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Um,
True.
but it's also from Spain, like that's not Latin literature.
Right, right,
True.
Um,
right.
Hmm.
and so like that's another thing where I'm like, you're bringing all of these writers. Like we have tons of writers in South America and Central America
Yeah.
and Mexico. And so I'm like, where are they?
Mhm,
Yeah.
Where are
mhm.
they in the
Hmm.
curriculums?
Yeah.
Um,
They
but
usually do focus just on Spain. Yeah.
Well, and also, and it's piggybacking on what you were saying earlier, Sorai, that it's also focusing on the struggle, right? Always, most,
mhm,
if not all, of the assigned books that we had to read was about the struggle and how, like, yeah, like Carreta and like all these things, or La Noche en que volvimos a ser gente, like all these stories that are about like how
Yeah.
horrible things were for Puerto Ricans, like in the olden days, or for the immigrants, and it's always how everything is terrible. And it was never like uplift, like you were saying. There's no uplifting stories or where we're, like victorious or anything. Everything's so defeatist always. I remember one of the
mhm,
books that I was reading, probably like in middle school, was Lautaro, and it was about the natives fighting the Spaniards, and it's horrible. It's a horrible. I mean, it was an awesome book. Don't get me wrong, but it doesn't end victoriously. So I think
I
that's
know.
kind of a good thing to always keep in mind. It's just that our stories don't have to be tragic; they can also be uplifting.
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah.
that's one of the great things about your book. It's just it kind of starts that way, like in the traditional way of like the tragic Hispanic story, and then it has that reversal at the end, where it's not necessarily a rejection, right? It's about the acceptance of your heritage, but then moving forward with like
Hmm.
your new heritage, because I think that's another part that's kind of ignored with a lot of contemporary Latinx stories. It's about just you as where you're from as opposed to like where you're going. So I don't know if you want to like
Yeah.
elaborate a little bit about that.
So also, I should say, like, Orquídea Divina, for those who don't know, are is about
Yes, please. Yeah, we're talking. I
uh
said
a
yeah, we all
woman.
read it.
It's about, yeah, we've all read it.
Yeah.
I appreciate it. It's about a woman, a woman's story, and she makes a deal with in her past, and she ends up, she lives her life in this very secluded kind of property, like a valley. It's her valley.
Mhm,
And she has had five husbands and a ton of children, and now she's in her 60s and she's about to die, so she invites her descendants, her living family, to come to this living funeral. And at the funeral she transforms into a tree, but before she does that, she gives three of her grandchildren, two grandkids, one great grandkid, I think, um, a bit of her power. And so the power manifests in different ways for the three of them. But several years later, the family starts dying one by one, and they know that it has something to do with this magic. Um, and so they have to go back to Ecuador to sort of find out why Orquídea had this power, where did it come from, and they have to uncover all these things, secrets about their grandmother that they never knew, because part of her bargain with this, in order to have this power, is that she could never talk about it. Um,
Mm,
and so I've gotten so many emails, and people come to my events that are not from Latin America, like Polish people and like Italians, and like people from all over, with
right.
ancestry from all over the world, who are like,
Hmm.
my grandmother never talked about the old country. She never
mhm,
talked about anything. She was very closed off and mean, and like, and it's funny because people, after Encanto came out, people are
mhm,
calling it the, like, adult Encanto, and I was like,
mhm,
because
mhm.
yeah, I'm like, yeah, there's technically a magical house and cousins with
Right.
magical powers, but also mine came out first.
Respect.
So in any case, Encanto is just a watered down version.
No, Encanto's the animated Orquídea, and so,
Okay.
and like, I loved it. I think that,
It's great.
but I
Yeah.
do think that it's, you can see the strings that connect us, right? So like,
Mhm,
Yeah.
uh, Lin Manuel and the collaborators, like the people, everybody who created Encanto, and me, like, we all have a thread, like we have this invisible thread, because we have a similar colonial background,
mhm,
and Ecuador and Colombia are right next to each other. Our
Yeah.
histories are tied. There would be no Ecuador and Colombia if they had never been the Gran Colombia first.
mhm.
Hmm.
And so we have such an incredible shared history and shared past, and so I'm not surprised that there was, an animated kid version,
Yeah.
that somebody created. It's just like the magic of storytelling, right? Like, we all get to tell versions of our stories, and through that we get to see um how close we really are.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the cool things about storytelling, especially when you start then going into like the realms of fantasy and sci-fi, right? So it's just start blurring the lines of how you're connecting to people, because then because of the veneer of fantasy and sci-fi, you remove the specificity of culture and language to kind of make it universal. And hopefully that was a elegant segue into kind of the Star Wars portion of everything, because through Star Wars, right, and sci-fi, we're able to start telling those same stories, just kind of with a different lens. And you have written a lot of books, but you've also written a lot of Star Wars stories and books. Obviously, we were talking about the High Republic Convergence, but you have a Crash of Fate. You have your stories on A New Hope from a certain point of view. The Tonica sister story, You Owe Me a Ride. You have the From a Certain Point of View, Wait For It, which is about Boba Fett. You have stories of Light and Dark, The Lost Night Sister, which is our girl Asajj Ventress, who's coming back and now in the
Yes.
Bad Batch, and then Tales of Light and Life, which continues the story of like a fan favorite Axel Greylark, which I call it like Axel in college, basically.
Mhm.
If I am interpreting that well. But before we get going into like the nitty gritty of how you're crafting these stories, I am also very interested in some background, information and how things, how the sausage is made, so to speak. So, like, how did you get into Star Wars, and like, what was that process of kind of breaking into Lucasfilm Publishing and starting to write your own stories within the galaxy, far, far away?
I I think I've told the story before, but just for those of you who haven't heard it, it I actually don't know how exactly I got into Star Wars Lucasfilm. I know that an editor from Lucasfilm reached out, and so I've created my own mythology where
We
I'm
love that. It's
pretty
okay.
sure it was a thing that I tweeted. Like I tweeted uh uh something about Poe Dameron where I was like, I would love to write Poe Dameron kissing his way through the galaxy, except I definitely didn't say kissing. Um, and but you know, like, and I swear the next day we got this email from Del Rey being like, "We're
Mhm.
doing this anthology. It's super secret. Um, does Zoraida want to be? We know she's a Star Wars fan. Does she want to write for it? And these are the characters that are still available." And I remember I immediately rewatched A New Hope, and of the characters that were still available, I was like, the Tonica sisters are not on here, and they're on screen for like a few seconds.
Mhm.
I know that they are. I know that there's like action figures based on them.
Mhm.
I know that there's short stories from like I think it was like the Tales from Jabba's Palace or something like that. I think that was Kevin Anderson. And so I went and I read that collection to see what they had done. And I know that in the legends they had connected Han, Lando, and the sisters. Um, which just feels like a recipe for disaster with
Mhm.
Lando and Han. But
Yeah, yeah.
Especially Lando, yeah.
but that was really fun. And so I picked them and wrote my story of, I write I feel like one of my favorite tropes is like, let's steal this car. I think
Mhm.
I had just binge watched Fast and Furious when I was writing that short story. Um, and so I was
It's
like, yeah,
modern mythology, Fast and the Furious, let's be
yeah,
honest, yeah.
they should try to steal um, the Millennium Falcon. And of course they fail because Han has to take off on it like right after. But that was like that's my origin story for Star Wars. I've never verified with Elizabeth if she actually saw that tweet or if it was just pure coincidence.
That it happened at that time.
Um, but let's just say it's the Force working its mysterious
Mhm.
ways.
Mhm.
Of
Mhm.
course.
And then after that, when Galaxy's Edge was getting opened up, I knew they were doing um, a theme park, and I wrote romance. I write romance as well.
Mhm.
And so uh, the Disney side reached out and asked if I would be interested in writing uh, a YA love story set on Batu. And of course, I said, "Where do you need me to sign? Is this like a
Yeah.
Rumpelstiltskin deal? Like, do you need my firstborn?" And they did not need my firstborn. Disney's just a regular company.
Just
No
just
fairy
th-
bargains.
just ironclad contracts. That's the only difference.
Yeah. No fairy tale bargains were made in the making of these books. But
Love that.
you know, and then after that, Mike Siglain, who's our fearless leader, who is just so incredible to work with. he was like, "Have you checked your email?" And I was like, "No,
What?
I'm on deadline, Mike." Like, "Oh, you should talk to your agent and check your email. I sent you something." And it was an
Oh.
invitation to be part of the High Republic.
Oh, there we go.
So,
That's the good
Oh,
stuff.
yeah, and so I was like, "Oh my god, I was so jealous about the High Republic." I was like, "This looks so cool. I
Mhm.
love
yeah.
all of these people." I hadn't met Kevin or Charles yet, but I knew, of course, like Claudia, Daniel, and
Mhm.
Justina, and so I was always just like rooting for them because they're such incredible creators, and I loved all of their work. Um, and so, then Tessa and Alyssa and George, and me, like we all, and Lydia, we all joined up
Mhm.
um, after in the second wave, and now it's just like we have like our Slack group, and uh, it's just like really wonderful.
Which is like what I was really gearing up to ask, because I'm infinitely curious, and it's kind of serendipitous, right, to talk about this now, because when was it? Yesterday or the day before was the 4-year anniversary of the announcement that the Luminous project was indeed the High Republic. So we're here celebrating the High Republic of phase one, and now we're in phase three. So it's great to be able to talk about it now, since there's a conclusion of sorts, but we know that the floodgates for High Republic are only opening because we have the Acolyte coming out and all these things. So it's a really fun
Yeah, Young
time to
Jedi
be
Adventures.
and Young Jedi
Yeah.
Adventures. So it's a really fun time to be a Star Wars fan, because you have now a completely new era in which to immerse yourself. That's that you don't need to have any backstory on. You can just start in fresh and not have to worry about all the baggage that the Skywalker saga has. Uh, but what was that process, right? Of like being, coming into the group of the Luminous authors, because there's already the roadmap, right, of where
Hmm.
where Charles and Kevin and Claudia and all those guys were planning out the High Republic to go. So what's it like to be like an author coming into the second phase and plugging into like a story that's kind of already laid out? How does your creativity and your storytelling plug into that?
I think that jumping into phase two,
Yeah.
um, was a very seamless process for me because I had already read the original content to see sort of like this is where we're heading,
Mhm.
right?
Hmm.
Um, and I started with the adult books, and then of course there's like the comics and the
Mhm.
YAs and the middle grades.
Hmm.
And so it was basically like looking at a giant world Bible.
Mhm.
Um, and and seeing sort of like where the Jedi are going. But first, we have to tell this story over here of these two planets. And
Yeah.
so when I was presented with the world of, um, we have the hyperspace lanes being built,
Mhm.
and these really wonderful prospecting teams, um, and the Jedi and the Republic are sort of working together, and then we ended up having two chancellors,
Mhm.
right? And so Gela was already a Jedi that was up for grabs. Um, and when I started creating, they were like, "All right, Arano and Eiram, like we've seen Eiram because of the fair,
Mhm.
and like the terrible things that are about to happen over there, but they're still at war, and so we're going back 150 years in the past, or however long, uh, you know, a significant amount of time. Like we're going back in time, and now we're 300 years from the uh, the Skywalker saga, um, and trying to think of the the outer rim looks like,
Mhm.
right?
Hmm.
And you have these two planets that are fighting, and they've been fighting for so long, nobody knows why. right? That's like it's very Romeo and Juliet. And that was my first
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
thought. I was like, that when I saw that note, I was like, it's Romeo and Juliet. They're going to get married. And so when I proposed, I was like, okay, so what if we have this alliance? You know, historically, alliances are built this way through monarchs, right? Like
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
you marry somebody so they won't attack your kingdom.
Yeah.
Uh, and and then I thought of that book, um, Hawk Song by Amelia
Right.
Atwater Rhodes,
Mhm.
and I was like, and I was like, okay, this is a very standard archetype and trope in a lot of high fantasy and history. So to me, it made perfect sense, and so I pitched the actual plot, um, and then the work was interconnecting it to the greater story of
Right.
phase two, which with the Evereni and the mother. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so, I got to build a lot of the Eiram and Erano's cultures, and because Erano is like a desert planet, um, I thought of like the but it's a desert. It's like more rocky desert than sandy
Mm-hmm.
dune
Mm-hmm.
desert.
Yeah.
I know sometimes people ask me if it's
More
like if
more
I envision,
Jeddah, less Jakku.
yeah, it's like, or Tatooine. It's like
Mm-hmm.
it's more um Southwest America,
Yeah.
with the rocks,
Yeah.
than Sahara Desert. Um, and so thinking about that, like, I the way that I build worlds is I'm like, all right, so we start with the landscape, right? How does this landscape then affect the people, right? There still is sand and dust, right? So they would have like things, technology that covers it. Uh, and in over here in the water world, we have like they'll have tsunami. Like the one thing that I knew about Eiram is that it had a lot of hurricanes and typhoons. And at the
Mm-hmm.
time I was living in Puerto Rico during the pandemic, because my family has my uncles have an apartment in San Juan,
Mm-hmm.
and so I had gone down there to check on the property, on this apartment, and then I was like, can I just stay here for uh and I just stayed, and I stayed for like a year and a half,
That's awesome.
Yeah.
and
I
that's
love that
so
you
I
wrote it
wrote.
here in
Yeah, it's
Puerto
one of
Rico. I love
it's
it.
one
Yeah,
of
so
I
those
love it.
small world type of things. It's like, oh crap, what?
yeah, and so I was like, so every time I would take like my every morning I would go on a beach walk because
Mm-hmm.
I was right by the beach, and um uh on by like Calle Loiza,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Uh-huh.
and so I go to the beach in Ocean Park and just walk around, um and I was like, oh, these beautiful blue turquoise waters. Iram now has beautiful blue turquoise waters.
Yes.
So a lot.
Canon, Aram is Puerto
Yeah, it's
Rico.
Aram is Puerto Rico, basically.
See?
Yes.
I mean, Fantu is definitely inspired by Ismael Cruz Cordova. I just gave him some green freckles.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and he's obviously in Lord of the Rings, but he was also in Star Wars in that one episode in The Mandalorian.
Mm-hmm.
But what was he? He was a purple Twi'lek.
Yes.
Um, yeah, and I was like, why would you hide his beautiful face under all of purple makeup? But
Yep.
that's fine.
We digress.
That just means
It's a
we
it's a good
should be
digression.
able to get him, cast him
If
in something where
yes,
he does
if
in his real face.
if Andy Serkis can be Snoke and then and then
Uh-huh.
play a completely different character in
Yeah.
Andor,
Yeah.
we can do it. It's like, come on, Star Wars.
The
We should
amount of
put him in the High
people who have
Republic. Yeah.
we should put him in the High Republic. I think he would be great. I mean, Fantu's still very young, but like I think that like he could definitely like I would love to see him as a Jedi or something like that. But anyway, that's sort of how I structured these worlds. I was like, okay, they because of these hurricanes and they're sort of this like they don't have a lot of drinking water. They would have to get drinking water when the the filtration system, the Jedi brought it in, right? In like
Mm-hmm.
in those first books. So they're still without this technology, and I had to think about like how how the topography and geography and all of their surroundings like affects like the things that they eat, um and how did the foods that they eat affect class,
Mm-hmm.
and their social structure, and um it's sort of a coincidence that Iram has two queens in two different books. And I
Mm-hmm.
was like, it's been a few hundred years. It's not like you have to have two queens, but that's how I concepted it. And before I had read
Right.
the other book, and I was like, well, it's been 100 years. It's time for another gay president, basically. Um,
Yeah, absolutely.
and so, yeah, and it it's a thing. Nobody would ask us like, why do you have three kings back to back, right?
Except,
But
yeah,
when you do
yeah.
when you have a
Yeah.
matriarchy, right? Like when you have a
Hmm.
matriarchy, I think that it's also really powerful and it shows people's relationships. I just really love creating fantasy worlds and thinking about everything that goes into effect. And the one thing, like Lydia and I came up together, like we were at the Savannah Book Festival, and I was like, all right, so like, um, she named the Thyle Fire scorpion. She named that because she was like, "This is this interesting scorpion that looks really alien in real life." And so we looked at its scientific name, and then we Star Warsified it,
Mm-hmm.
Right.
um, which is what people have done for other species, like the
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Carcharodon.
Hmm.
Um, Definitely. And so, like, doing even like the most minuscule things, and I'm like, these scorpions are symbolic of how they basically, like, it's like the theory of evolution, right? Like, you have one species that splits, and so
Right.
that's what these scorpions symbolize, right? Like in Eiram, they're in Arano, they're just there and they're food, and in Eiram, they're poisonous and
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
deadly. Um,
I love
and
that.
so yeah, I so like those just like minutia. Those are small details, but and then there's just like the regular world of Star Wars,
Mm-hmm.
like with our Jedi. And I loved writing Gela and Axel together, and I loved writing Fantu and Ziri because my favorite trope is um a tough girl and a cinnamon roll boy.
I love that too. It's so good.
It's
I mean, but
yeah,
it really speaks too much so much to the fact that you love kind of high fantasy because world
Mm-hmm.
building is so important in high fantasy and how like the world influences the characters and how the
Mm-hmm.
characters influence back. And I thought that was really cool to bring into like your vision of what Star Wars should be. And we
Mhm.
always love a love story because aside from Star Wars always being political, it's always also been a love story. So I think
Yeah.
it's just really fun to see it from different perspectives, and especially when you're not tied to the Skywalker saga to have a little bit more
Mm-hmm.
creative
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
freedom in what you decide to do. So I think that's what's really great about the High Republic and why so many of us are so in love with it. So thank you.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, you're most welcome. I feel very privileged to be able to write in this world that, the original architects set up for us. I think it's such it's such a wonderful um type of storytelling because there's something for everybody, right? There's something
Mhm.
for the youngest kid. They just sent me a Nubs, like the Nubs
Oh yeah, Nubs
plushie.
Nation, baby. Yeah.
Nubs Nation, and I'm just like, I love it. The other day, I had a headache and I just laid down and I just binge watched Young Jedi Adventures, and I was like, this is so
It's really good.
sweet. I loved it. I mean, I remember I watched the first few episodes and then like just straight through, because it's closer in tone to my new middle grade.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Um,
Mhm.
but yeah. So and then writing the short story The Queen's Bloom
Mm-hmm.
for Stories of Light and Life, which was a little bit of uh we decided, was like, okay, I think people want to see more of Axel, and I was like, all right, I would love to write Axel as a teenager
Mhm.
in like university, being like, I have always been a chaos monster, but you see the seeds of the person that he's going to become, right? Like,
Yeah.
Mhm.
um it's not as bad as when Anakin killed all of the sand people and then everybody
Mhm.
acted like nothing happened. But
Right.
um, we see that uh he just wants to have a connection.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And there's somebody there ready to take advantage of that, with Alicia, the mother.
Mhm.
Um and so I really loved writing that short story because I wanted also to see, I wanted to write something playful. And so
Hmm.
this is like my space version of Ferris Bueller's Day Off.
Nice.
Um
I love
the original title was Axel Brailer's Day Off, but I was like, oh, I already have a comic called this. And I think they wanted
that.
something a little bit more serious.
Nice. I did want to ask though. We were talking about Axel a little bit, but I just have like a particular question about Gela specifically. I love that character, but one question that's always been burning in my mind is like when the cover was revealed for Convergence, I could not stop thinking that that's Adria Arjona as Gela, and
Yo,
I'm just
it
like,
is just a super coincidence.
because
It is just a
it's
super
on
coincidence.
the nose. I'm just like, wait, is this a
It
casting thing? Because
I
I'd be down for it.
don't know. Like, I don't even know who the reference model was, because in the original concept art,
Hmm.
Hmm.
she she does look very similar, but the when you do the real life 3D version,
Hmm.
Hmm.
or like a more realistic art, um she looks more like Adria Arjona.
Hmm.
And also, did you know that Adria Arjona is actually Ricardo Arjona's
Yeah,
daughter?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
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 I didn't know
Yeah.
that.
She's half Puerto
Last
Rican
until
too. Yeah,
Yeah.
because her mom's Puerto
last
Rican, and
year,
then
yeah,
yeah,
Yeah.
her mom is Boricua and her dad, and he's from Guatemala.
Yeah.
And I went to the Ricardo Arjona concert with my aunt and my uncle,
hmm.
and then when I was scrolling on Instagram, she was like with a picture of her dad, and I was
Oh, you
like,
were
oh,
the
I
same
never
show.
thought about.
Yeah,
I was like, I never thought
Wait.
about that their last name
The
was the
connection.
same. And
Yeah.
she was like, mi papa, and I was like, oh my
yeah, yeah.
god,
What?
he had the most gorgeous daughter. Jeez.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but yeah, no, that is like a super coincidence. I don't know how that happened. I get that question a lot. But
Apologies, but I had
I'm
to
not the
know.
I'm not the artist, so it's
Yeah.
just setting the record straight that it's just another beautiful Latina from somewhere.
Yeah.
Which just out of curiosity now, like how much as an author with these Star Wars book, like how much input do you have like on these covers of what the cover should be? Is that something that you're in the loop for, or is this just like Del Rey or whoever is just
I
running
think
with it?
that Star Wars in particular does a really wonderful job at trying to include us. I don't know how much, like, I always trust the creative team, like the art department, because the
Hmm.
art department knows what is going to look good together.
Hmm.
Also, we
Yeah.
have to think of these as a series,
Yeah.
right? Like,
Yeah.
when I saw the concept art for Temptation of the Force, I was like, by Tessa Grattan,
Hmm.
Tessa and I was like, Tessa, oh my God, this, like, there were every cover has a few different positions, right?
Hmm.
Like
Hmm.
the characters in a few different positions. So they do ask for our opinion, which I think is really wonderful. I've had definitely publishers who are like, "This is the cover. We're very happy with it," and that language is like to let you know that they don't want it. They don't
Right.
actually want
Any input
your
whatsoever.
It's like
any
this
Yeah.
is your
input.
this is your opportunity to
Yeah.
agree.
But with Star Wars, like, Mike and the editors, like, they'll say like, what do you think, like, and so most of the time I'm always so amazed by the kinds of artists that Star Wars has, at their disposal. So like I just got to see the concept art for the cover of Beware the Nameless,
Mm-hmm.
and there is like a tie to Convergence
Yeah.
in this middle grade, um,
Mm-hmm.
which I'm really really excited about. This book is like so precious to me, and the plot of Beware the Nameless is a group of kids, a group of younglings, and a very new special character whom I love them so much. Um, and a Republic kid. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
they get stranded. You know what? Let me actually look at the Amazon thing so I don't reveal too much.
Too
But
much.
it's like
If you slip, it's okay.
yeah.
We won't mind.
I'm pretty sure this is on the summary. Um but yeah, so like it's about like it continues the adventure uh from Daniel and Alyssa's book.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um yeah. So yeah, and it carries some of the original characters from from Daniel and Alyssa's book as
Mm-hmm.
well. So it's like some old, some new, um, and the artwork, like you know how like the middle grades have that artwork in the middle.
Yeah.
I was like, I need to have these as posters for myself because they're so incredibly beautiful. And actually, the planet that we're going to in Beware the Nameless is inspired by Galapagos in
Okay.
Ecuador.
Nice.
Ah, wow.
So it's always like my first inspiration is always like, all right, where in Latin America have we not gone yet in
Uh-huh.
Star Wars?
Mm-hmm.
And now let's do it. Let's go there. So
I love that, which is like one of the things that I really wanted to ask about because it's something that we're very interested in talking about with this podcast. 'Cause when we made it, we're like we don't have any, or that we're aware of, right? As Puerto Rican podcasts or Latinx podcasts that are really focused on talking about Star Wars from like our point of view. So that's kind of always been our mission, and we've been very privileged to be chosen at Star Wars Celebration to host the podcast stage, and like we've talked about representation there. So we're always, on the search to keep, pushing the narrative of representation to anyone who'll listen to us. So that's something that we wanted to ask you. It's like how does, because Star Wars, is this abstract sci-fi thing that's removed from our reality but still connects to our reality
Yeah.
through its themes and whatnot. How do you personally feel? I mean, you touched on it a little bit now, but how do you feel that you're able to project your cultural background to characters or locations that aren't technically anchored in our Latinx identity, but still want to project it so we can represent our cultures,
yeah,
right, through
I
Star
mean,
Wars?
it's so hard because like in Star Wars in space, humans are one race,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
right? Uh, but you can still see the threads of it, right? Like in uh, there's all of Star Wars has this idea of exploration and a lot like even in the older books, right? Like the Legends books also cover things like refugees coming from planet to planet,
Yeah.
wars between species in different planets,
Mhm.
and all of that is a mirror into our own world. They're
Mm-hmm.
just not. We have to pull from somewhere. I don't actually believe that you can make something from nothing. Like you can't make
Right.
Yeah.
even homeboy who wrote Dune. I always
Mm-hmm.
forget his name. I'm sorry for
Frank Herbert,
Frank Herbert.
I think.
I didn't. Oh, yes, no, you're correct.
Okay,
The
thank
book
you.
is
I'm just like,
somewhere on one of
did
my. It's
I pull that
Did I
out?
screw that up?
or
Right.
Yeah.
Hebert. I look. It's fine. Drag me. I don't care. I read Dune because I had this boyfriend in college who read one of the YA novels that I love. So I read Dune and he read that book and he didn't like my book and I didn't like Dune. But I mean, look,
We've all
we
been there. We've all been there.
did not work out. But anyway, so that's my Dune. I'm triggered. Uh, but with even Dune, right? Like Dune is uh has a lot of analogs, and all fantasy has an analog.
Hmm.
And when it doesn't have an analog or claims not to have an analog, I'm sure that I can look at it and pull imagery and tell you exactly what the history of this imagery comes from, and
Hmm.
it'll generally be medieval Europe,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And
Yep.
Yeah.
so all fantasy has a root, and it's we're just lying to ourselves when we say that, like, oh, the real world has no impact. And I'm like, yes, we can use fantasy as a layer between
Yeah.
us and the real world, right? It allows us to look at the problems that we have in the real world, the conflicts that we have, the great things that we have, right? It allows us to do this at a distance, because we're creating a separate world inspired by something else. um and that's why I don't really like, I when I read a book and the world building sort of all over the place, like, it really takes me out of the story, because, like,
Yeah.
I
Hmm.
feel like I need to write something. I will always strive to write with intentionality.
Hmm.
And so if I choose a certain name, um I have looked at the root of that name and why it means a certain thing.
Hmm.
And I could also just take a lamp and name someone Palm, because I scrambled the words. You know what I
Hmm.
mean? And so,
Yeah.
um, but that comes but that comes from somewhere, and so you know, I think that the more people who write in Star Wars, the more we get to see different points of views, like, no pun
Yeah.
intended. And I think that's a great thing. We have a giant galaxy,
Yeah.
and there's room for so many stories. I don't remember what the beginning of the question was, but sometimes I go off in these, like,
Oh no, please.
l- long thoughts. So I feel like my mind takes a walk. Um, but yeah, that's where we can start on this part of the conversation.
Yeah, because you were saying that about specifically about fantasy, and just reminded me, like I read a couple of years ago, cou- fairly recently, a book called Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse, which is,
Oh yeah,
you
I love
know,
her. She's the best.
which is basically the thing you were saying. It's a fantasy book, but it's kind of rejecting the trope of being about medieval Europe as the
Mhm.
basis of creating a fantasy world, and it just uses Mesoamerica as the basis for
Mhm.
fantasy, which was a breath of fresh air, right? Because it's not something that we're
Yeah.
accustomed to, but it just shows the diversity that fantasy has to just be whatever you want it to be, and have it connect to different people in different ways through that type of historical background, which, like we were saying at the beginning, right when we started talking, it's like things that, like, the three of us weren't really exposed to when we were young, starting to read stories about, like, our cultures. It's like, and I think that now authors are kind of taking it upon themselves to start making those stories that we didn't have access to, or weren't available, or didn't even exist when we were growing up. So it's definitely, like, I think, a kind of a beautiful thing that is happening now, because there's no time like the present. um so to that point, right, we're talking about injecting representation into Star Wars, and I have like like two questions about that for you. It's like, one, to tie back when we were talking about Orquídea Divina and talking about magical realism. I think that's a writing genre of writing, right? That it's very, I don't want to say limited, but very anchored in a certain genre and timeline and historicity. Do you think that there is a flexibility for magical realism to be incorporated into Star Wars, and how do you imagine that happening?
You know, uh that so yes and no. I think that there is there's room for different genres in Star
Yeah.
Wars, right? Like, only a romance novel, only a thriller,
Hmm.
only a murder mystery. I would love to see a murder mystery in Star Wars.
Hmm.
I think that would be
Like, we
great,
need
actually.
we need
Yeah.
a Hercule Poirot of Star
Hmm.
Wars. Um, but I don't think that magical realism could fit into Star Wars, and the reason is because magical realism is this idea that things happen and magic is mundane. right? And they happen without explanation. And so if we look at some of the history of magical realism, a lot of the things are just like, Garcia Marquez and Isabel Allende and Borges, and so they're writing in this tradition where they can't explain why something happened, right? Like, did your grandmother, did your uncle, I use grandmothers a lot. Did your uncle vanish from, did your uncle vanish from town because he was carried off by an angel? Or did he actually vanish because the militia in the town over from like the neighboring dictator is coming and attacking your village, right? Like, and so not being able to have those answers is part of also what makes magical realism what it is, right? Like we can't explain the things that we believe and the superstitions that we have and whether or not they come true. A girl with green hair, right? Like this girl with green hair is just born into a family. A girl with a flower coming out of her wrist is born into another family. An angel falls into town and lives in the chicken coop, which is one of Garcia Marquez's short stories.
Yeah.
And so it's like these things cannot be explained. But in Star Wars, we have an explanation. It's the Force, and or it's the witches of Dathomir, right? And so because we have a root and an explanation, I think it would be harder to do. Which is not to say it's impossible, but it's a little that to me is like the divide. Because then it's just fantasy, right? Like when you can explain the magic, it's fantasy. And then when white people write magical realism, it's fabulism.
Yeah. It's two different ways of dealing with the magical. And especially what you were saying in Star Wars, there's already a very ingrained system of how things are supposed to work. So that is why I think, that Realismo Mágico would be hard to like plug it in. Unless it's like we go into this planet that knows nothing about what's happening, knows nothing about the Force.
Just nothing about the Force.
Which would be interesting, actually, when they can't explain why the magical things that happen around them are happening because they have no knowledge of the Force or anything else. That could be
I would love to see it. I would love to see it. I think that there's room for so many things. We have like the samurai novel that
Ronin,
Ronin,
Emma Miko,
and for all intents and purposes, I feel like every book that Claudia Gray wrote was a romance. Like I remember being so, every time I see Claudia, every time we hang out, I'm like, Claudia, Lost Stars 2. I want to cry all the time when I think of like the ending of Lost Stars. It's my favorite Star Wars book.
Not to brag.
I mean, and I think a lot of fans, if not most fans, if not every fan, feels the same way.
My new favorite book. Sorry to cut you off. My new favorite book is about to be Temptation of the Force by Tessa Gratton.
I'm really based on the cover. I'm really looking forward to that one for sure. Which keeping it, in High Republic as we kind of like, start wrapping things up. We've talked about representation, we talked about magical realism, and I think one of the really cool things that we were talking about High Republic as a whole is what a great job it has been doing in terms of like representation and diversity for how all the characters that it's introducing, and a lot of non-binary characters or LGBTQ characters and all those things. And one thing that we have been very vocal on this podcast has always been how Star Wars has been a little slow, especially compared to like other franchises like Star Trek, to be blunt, how forward they are in terms of like how they're introducing more diversity into their stories. And while High Republic has been great so far, there's still work to be done. So like in your opinion, like what do you think Star Wars as a whole can learn from the High Republic, or what more would you like to see the High Republic do, or Disney Plus or the films do in terms of representation in stories?
That's hard to say because I don't know what's in the work. I don't know the plans for Rey. Although I am really excited to see those. I think one of the biggest one of the biggest disappointments for me as a fan was not being able to see Finn as a
Mhm,
Jedi.
mhm, mhm.
Yeah.
I think that like I love him as a character, and he just sparkles. Him and Oscar Isaac um
Yeah.
just like sparkle when they're together, the three of them, and but I think that we one thing that I am excited about the Acolyte is that
Mhm,
it has
mhm,
such a diverse cast, and it is
Yeah.
High Republic, right? It's High Republic. I think that Obi-Wan had a diverse
mhm.
cast, um,
Yeah.
and then but it's not what Star Wars can do. It's what can the fans do? Like what
Mhm,
the
mhm, mhm.
like we have this like this part of the fandom that isn't very kind to these actors
Yeah.
or to Black
Mhm.
women,
Mhm.
and
Yep.
that is just that's like the biggest hurdle.
Yeah.
But because you can't make fiction for everybody, right?
Mhm.
Like
Mhm.
you can think that it is, and I do believe Star Wars is for everybody, and we go at it with this intent, but because it means so much to so many people,
Yeah.
everybody wants to possess it as like this
Yeah.
Mhm,
belongs
mhm.
to us. Why are you changing it? Why are you ruining my childhood? And I'm like,
Right.
Yeah. Mhm.
I don't. Your childhood is still there. The
Right.
original movies haven't gone anywhere,
Yeah.
Exactly,
and
exactly.
I for one do not want them rebooted. Um,
No. No.
but it's like they're not going anywhere. It's just this is not the story you saw in your head because it is outside of the things that you experience on an everyday basis. But for some of us, we live, like our lives are, for all, like, just to use that word, like diverse. Like we have so many kinds of people. Like
Yeah.
I'm like the token straight person in my friend group, um, which is weird to say.
Yeah, I mean, it's like,
Um,
oh, that's
Yeah.
interesting.
like and
Mhm.
or and so it's kind of uh if we the Star Wars cannot be our world.
Mm,
It can take inspiration from our world, but like for all intents and purposes, Star Wars almost has to be better than what we do. Like
mhm, mhm.
Yeah.
fiction is an idealized version of our
Yeah.
world, a mirror or an upside down mirror sometimes. And so it I want to see more. The one thing that I would love to see more is like I would love to see Afro Latino and Indigenous Latino
Yes.
representation
Mhm.
Yeah.
actors in live action, because I feel like we have Rosario Dawson and we have Ismael, but they're both
Mhm.
in costume and
Mhm.
playing like aliens. And so I think that we can do a better job at that. But I'm not a casting manager,
Right.
and I don't want to tell anybody. I don't want to offend anybody on how to do their job, but I do think that there's room for those stories. But that's a Hollywood problem. That's not a Star Wars
That
Yeah,
is correct. Yeah.
problem.
Mhm.
And for all, it's like it's also what we have done. Like we have given an image to the world of what Latino is supposed to look like and Latinx, and so we've sort of created uh our own, but that's a different conversation.
yeah. It's a. I mean, yeah. There's definitely like a
That's a
part
whole
two.
entire episode.
That's a part two for this.
Yeah.
But yeah. Before we wrap up, what other we know you have you're working on or done. I don't know what state of the process you're on. For Beware the
Yeah.
Nameless, but is there anything you can tell us about Beware the Nameless or any other phase 3 fun stuff that you have going along or other projects that you're working on that you want to tell us and
Yeah.
people listening?
So Beware the Nameless, like we're still wrapping it up. I think that it's a really fun middle grade adventure. I my favorite one of my I keep saying my favorite thing is this, but then I say another
Do you
thing is my
change it
favorite.
again?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah, because I love so many things, right? And so
You
it
can
has
have
like
many favorite things.
that's true.
a group of unlikely friends, working together to save themselves and save the day. And so of course there's Nameless in there, so we get to see
Mhm.
some of these like creatures, and the different kinds of creatures. After you read book one, Daniel and Melissa's book, um, but it also stands on its own as a book. Um, and it it was like a joy for me writing and creating some of these characters and some there is a tie to Convergence
Hmm. Hmm.
um in one of the characters. Um and I hope that people like it. I think it's like, uh for like middle grade to me is, I know adults read it and kids read it, but kids are always my first audience,
Hmm. Hmm.
you know,
Yeah.
when it comes to stuff like that. And then I'm working on my next adult book, which is called, God damn it, what's it called? Um, it's tentatively titled The Fall of Rebel Angels.
Mm.
And it's a contemporary fantasy, like urban fantasy,
Hmm.
about one of the angels from Lucifer's rebellion, whose punishment is to fall for eternity, like fall from, the celestial plane.
Right.
Hmm.
And every time he lands on Earth, every 100 years, he has 7 days to find his wings. And this time, things are a little bit different because he's been pulled out of that cycle 3 years
Hmm.
early. And he's landed in this woman's garden, and she is accused of disappearing her ex-lover. Um,
Disappearing.
yeah.
Yeah.
Whatever that means.
Is he dead?
Yeah.
We don't know.
Hmm.
We don't know if he's dead. He's just missing.
Yeah.
And she's been in an accident too. And they basically join forces to find redemption for each other. And it's a very ambitious book for me because there's a lot of history in the angel. Like every it takes place over the course of 7 days, with some interstitials into the past, like Orquídea Divina.
Hmm.
Um, and so it it's a feat for me, and it's also incredibly long for me as well.
How long so
It's
far?
right now it's 100,000 words right now. Um,
It's a lot
which
of
I don't
words.
know. It's longer than Convergence, and Convergence was, I think, my longest book to date. Um, so we'll see. Like I'm really excited. It comes out in 2025.
Okay.
I think summer 2025. And so there's still a little bit of a wait, but I really love this
Hmm.
book. I think it's like it's a weirdo romance with angels and occult stuff.
Hmm.
I'm all
Um,
in. I can't wait for that to be
Yeah.
released. I'm all in.
We'll put our pre-orders from now after today.
so yeah, I'm really excited about it. I love it so much. And so those are the two things I'm working on. Aside from like the million side projects and side
Mhm.
hustles, because the work never ends. Um,
That's good
and
though.
yeah,
It's better than the
It's
alternative.
yeah,
work. Yeah.
exactly. So yeah, that's what I've got going.
Great,
Awesome.
thank you. I mean, this has been like an amazing conversation. It's one of those conversations that could go on forever because there's, so many tangents that we could have taken. So like, we just have to restrain ourselves to make this palatable. So hopefully, like in the future, we can just have you over and keep talking because this has been truly, truly a privilege. But before we sign off, where can people find you on the socials if they want to follow your thoughts and your adventures? What are those links?
My website is zoraidacordova.com, and on Instagram I'm Zoraida Solo, like Han Solo. And
Mhm.
I don't have Twitter anymore, but I have Blue Sky, and it's the same handle as my old Twitter handle, which is Z like in Zorro, the phrase Z like in Zorro. And I'm now I delete all my apps when I'm on deadline off my
I
phone.
see.
So I'm not like, because there's a moment where I'm always like, okay, I'm just gonna doom scroll for 2 hours.
Yep.
And so I delete it to just save myself. But now I'm back. So
Try Threads. Just saying. Threads is
oh,
it's
Threads.
cool.
Okay.
Yeah. Uh, it's just too many. I feel like the whole social media landscape is just
So many
a
apps.
disaster
Yeah.
now because it's the whole thing with not supporting Twitter because of what, and then some are in Blue Sky, and then some are in Threads, some are in Substack.
I
So
miss
I'm just
look,
like,
I
there's
love I love Star Wars Twitter so much. I do miss it.
Hmm.
Um, but I just had too many people trying to break into my account. Like every week I would get like an email like change your
Wow.
password, and I'm
Oh
like,
my god,
why? Like
that
I I have like 2 followers. Like relax.
that's yeah. That I get it. That sounds exhausting. But yeah, give
Yeah.
Threads a try. Give Threads a try. Because that's where we're at. So we'll be self-serving on that. But
Yeah.
yeah, we digress. Thank you so much, Sarayda, for like joining us. This has
Thank
been
you guys.
an
I appreciate
amazing
it so much.
conversation. Such a good time. So yeah, until the next time, which hopefully will be sooner rather than later. Maybe when the next book comes out, maybe.
Hmm.
So yeah, Nani, you have something else before we wrap up?
No, it was so amazing to talk to you, Soraila. I love that you put like a fantasy kind of twist into Star Wars, and it's been really great talking to you and to learn how your creative process works. So thank you so much for joining us. And we love us some Latinas that are writing, that are gorgeous, that are into Star Wars, because there's been some conversations that Star Wars is not for women,
Sure.
and
Yeah, yeah,
yep,
Oh, are we there again? Is it?
uh-huh,
yeah,
we're
yeah.
there
Oh,
again. Yep.
It's
it's
happened
so
So
again.
silly.
so to prove those, people wrong, Star Wars is for everybody.
That's does I'm
Yeah.
like I would love to say like to those people, does it ever get exhausting being wrong?
Yeah. Just I
I don't know.
I
It's
don't know.
it's it's a thing.
But anyway, until next time, we are Triad of the Force. Thank you again, Soraya, for being with us. Like, comment, subscribe, leave a comment. Check out Soraya's stuff because it's really, really amazing. And we look so much forward to all your other projects that are coming into force. So we love you. Until next time, may the Force be with you.